it's going to be decades before AI gets to the point where it can essentially model what we call theory of mind in psychology, whereby it has a better sense of what's going on inside a person's mind or motivations as it reads the expressions, and better that we try to anticipate early on using techniques like technology assessment to try to understand what are the ramifications. If we develop a particular new technology, what are the primary, secondary, and tertiary effects? Now imagine if every computer in our society went down, if everything that keeps the lights on, everything that takes care of the logistics, moves food around, everything went away. We would be in chaos very, very quickly. People would starve, people would unfortunately die. This is actually a very, very real scenario in the future space, and it's one that we don't actually address often enough.
Richard Yonck, futurist, speaker, writer who focuses on future trends, technologies, and their impact on society. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about. Richard, welcome in the studio.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Could you first explain what a futurist actually means?
Okay. There are a number of different ways to be a futurist, but generally speaking, for myself and in general, it involves not predicting, but helping businesses and audiences to understand and prepare for different types of change that are likely to come about.
Okay. And could you describe more deeply what does a futurist do? How does he work?
Sure.
How does he work?
So it varies a lot because of the different types of clients and the different types of projects. Sometimes it can be actually designing a longer term project to explore and understand for a corporate client how a particular technology or a particular trend is likely to impact their business and their customer base. Other times it might be as short or straightforward as doing an initial presentation to kick off a leadership summit, or performing at a conference such as Innovation Week to inspire and inform.
Could you please give us some example of your, let's say, cooperation with your clients or?
Sure, of course. As one recent example, a client that is a large grocery chain in the United States wanted to explore the issues to be concerned about around artificial intelligence, but also other technological advances in relation to both their products and their stores. They were already a very high-tech grocery chain. They utilized robotics. They utilized sensors in ways that many aren't already, but they wanted to understand the challenges and the opportunities going forward in the coming decades. There are all kinds of things in a world where supply chains can be interrupted due to either climate issues or different types of conflict and so forth. Sure. And so understanding this and being prepared for, okay, what do we do instead if the chips that we're dependent on are 4 times more expensive than they once were? It affects how people lay out their strategy going forward.
Okay. As I said, you are a writer who focuses on future trends, on technologies, AI, etc. One of your big ideas is that as AI develops, it's not just going to be about smarter machines, but also about machines that understand human emotions. And can kind of interact with us on that level. So could you please describe in more detail how you think about that?
Certainly. So back in the mid-20 teens, I was aware of and writing a number of articles around what were essentially systems that were interacting with human emotions, and realized that there really wasn't a good book around this subject. So I wrote Heart of the Machine, which essentially looked at the systems that were being developed that could read, interpret, and interact with human emotion. Okay. This has a lot of potential application because we are at our core emotional beings. And it's one of the ways that in many respects machines and AI have not been able to interact with us in the past. So being able to read and have at least some sense of what a person's emotional state is, their attention, other things, has potential use cases that could be beneficial for a user. In more recent years, because of concerns around sensors, privacy, security, there's been some pullback. It's definitely still continuing, but the conditions and the situations, people are not looking to, design systems that basically pull information off of security cameras and tell you what an emotional state is for a person, because that really is not the kind of society that most of us want.
Okay. You mentioned some benefits of this, and what are the risks on the other side?
Yes. So the risks are multifold because, as with all technologies, things can be used in ways that the people who originally created it didn't actually intend. There are cases in certain countries where it's used to keep track of the emotional state of employees, to ensure that they essentially maintain a particular mindset or mental state, which maybe for some countries in the West is not so much what we want for in terms of our personal liberties and so forth. There's also issues around if you're able to read a person's emotions in real time. You can a system that interacts with this, a computer system, can operate with essentially a real-time feedback loop. This is something I've written about where essentially you could be put at disadvantage by what I refer to sometimes as predatory marketing methods, where essentially you're sold something you don't necessarily even want or need, but because a system is able to anticipate and understand how you are emotionally responding to it, it can alter its script in real time and persuade you more easily.
Okay. And as for the ability to read humans' emotions, how is the situation now?
Well, the original concept involved what was essentially labeling different types of expressions. There was work on micro-expressions done decades ago that some of that drew off of, and it had some basis. But the problem is that, as most of us understand, and as people have essentially said against artificial emotional intelligence or emotion AI, a person can hide their emotions. You can smile and not be happy. You can, put on other faces, and you're not actually just because you're smiling doesn't mean that you feel good. Yeah. So it's a problem in terms of labeling and understanding. And in my mind, it's going to be decades before AI gets to the point where it can essentially model what we call theory of mind in psychology, whereby it has a better sense of what's going on inside a person's mind or motivations as it reads the expressions, and therefore is able to make better assessments about what they're actually feeling. If I look at you, I'm making all kinds of non-verbal assessments based on different responses, but also my understanding or looking at the conditions, the situation we're in, and all of these things. And these aspects of theory of mind really are what make the human interaction and communication of emotions so powerful.
Okay. And what do you think about the possibility, maybe some could call it a danger, that people will become more emotionally attached to machines than humans?
It's certainly been something that has been going on. We've noted stories in the news where this happens from time to time. People love to write about it. There have actually been, because of how we bond and attach and form different kinds of emotional connection, occasionally this goes awry, goes wrong for people, and literally has done so for thousands of years. This isn't necessarily new to the technology. There are people who have literally claimed to have fallen in love with an inanimate object. And this isn't particular or specific to artificial emotional intelligence, but at the same time, the potential for manipulating a person in this regard is certainly greater using a technology like this.
So, speaking about the future, what will be the impact, in your opinion? Because AI, which is able to understand people or humans' emotion, could be maybe, I don't know how to say it, but could be better communication with it, because it will be nicer to you. It will be recognize your needs, your etc. What do you think about that?
Certainly. So, kind of a multi-part question. I'll just say right off the top of my head that chatbots like ChatGPT already respond in a way that is meant to be complementary to you in order to not just engage you, but to keep you going, to keep you engaging with it. It's kind of a new take on the different forms of social media where you are endlessly scrolling and so forth. And it's about keeping you on the platform in some respects. That's very simple. That doesn't really even need more than a human giving some instructions initially during the programming of how to respond. In the case of a system that can actually read, it won't necessarily truly understand. That's the thing with AI in general. AI still doesn't have the ability to internalize and truly understand complex matters when we talk to it and so forth. It's simply going through algorithms, averaging out a range of different responses and so forth, and giving the most, ideally, the most appropriate one. But that doesn't make it have comprehension. And that's an important distinction, and will be for some time. It'll be quite a while, I think, before we actually get to the point where these systems truly understand versus can fake it.
Okay, understand. And should we prepare ourselves for that phase?
Well, as with most technology, but particularly in this more recent age of digital technologies and now AI, maintaining both personally but also in education a certain level of striving for literacy, digital literacy, AI literacy, media literacy, understanding the challenges and the tricks and the vulnerabilities is very, very important as we move into the modern era, because we're working with things that we didn't evolve with in nature. They are new and need to be grasped in relation to what their capabilities are and what their dangers are.
You have also got some interesting thoughts on how AI might shape human evolution in the long run. Basically, how we might co-evolve with our technology. How would you describe that?
Sure. So just as I spoke about in my keynote an hour or two ago, we have been co-evolving with technology really for 4 million years. This is something that began with early man, Australopithecus, the beginnings of technology with the shaping of stone tools and eventually development of fire, developing of speech, and then later technologies. Each of these has not only been changed by us, but in turn, it has changed us. These things have changed us physically, mentally, and culturally, such that we are continually adapting to the new technologies that we have. A very, very recent example is because of how the internet has developed, because of how social media has essentially engaged us, because it makes being engaged is how they keep you on the platform. This has led to essentially systems that take advantage of our Darwinian responses. And by doing that, we really are put at something of a disadvantage.
You talking few moments ago about the importance of media literacy, digital literacy, but what about some institutional level? I mean, the legislation, etc. What do you think we should do specifically to eliminate the risks which can come?
Well, as with most technologies, we can never fully eliminate the risks. We have cars, we have weapons, we have different chemicals in our environment that it's very, very hard to absolutely ensure that a person doesn't use these things for negative purposes. In terms of regulation, I do believe that there has to be some, but we can't simply regulate our way out of these problems. The thing is that overregulation is only going to send certain developments underground, make people do things outside of being observed, and therefore they're going to not only happen anyway, but perhaps happen with even fewer safeguards in place. Better that we try to anticipate early on using techniques like technology assessment, as I spoke earlier about AI-enhanced technology assessment, to try to understand what are the ramifications. If we develop a particular new technology, what are the primary, secondary, and tertiary effects that can come about because of bringing this into place? When the automobile was developed, people were not thinking about, what is its impact going to be on the future climate because of the emissions it's putting out? These are secondary, third level effects that essentially trying to understand these in advance can give us an opportunity to create safeguards, create guardrails, create alternate methods that perhaps have less negative impact.
Okay.
Týden inovací, jedna z nejvýznamnějších tuzemských událostí v oblasti inovací, převratných technologií a umělé inteligence, v roce 2025 oslavil už 10. výročí existence. Každoroční svátek všech inovátorů a nadšenců přelomových řešení pravidelně na jednom místě prezentuje okolo 300 skvělých řečníků, ať už jde o špičky tuzemské inovační scény nebo výjimečné osobnosti ze zahraničí. Dále desítky diskuzních panelů, inovativních nápadů a technologií z různých oborů, inspirativní semináře nebo projekty zaměřené na podporu startupů a žen podnikatelek. Zapište si už teď. 11. ročník týdne inovací proběhne 1. a 2. října 2026.
Your latest book, Mindstock, which you brought to studio, is, if I have the right information, techno thriller about dystopian AI, truth, manipulation, surveillance. Could you please be more specific about what the book is about, and most importantly, what conclusions or insights you draw from it.
Absolutely. So I've been a futurist for a very long time. I've written a lot of nonfiction in the form of both books and articles, and it lets you explore in a certain way. But the thing about fiction is there's an opportunity to both go deeper but also a little wider, because a client isn't looking for certain fictional, very less than likely possibilities. In the case of this book, it takes place in the aftermath of a catastrophic global cyber attack that wipes out all information systems. Now imagine if every computer in our society went down, if everything that keeps the lights on, everything that takes care of the logistics, moves food around, everything went away. We would be in chaos very, very quickly. People would starve, people would unfortunately die. This is actually a very, very real scenario in the future space, and it's one that we don't actually address often enough, because I happen to know from speaking with different cybersecurity people that it's actually something that worries a lot of people very significantly. From there, the book develops decades down the way into looking at a very different kind of fairly totalitarian society, but one where people are comfortable enough that they're willing to put up with it. And all jobs have gone away. Automation has taken over everything. And as a result, we're in a different kind of space that I wanted to explore as we look ahead at how certain trends around kind of our post-truth society that we're already entering, as this expands, as people come to trust information less and less, where does this lead us? How does this develop? And that was the impetus, the motivation behind writing this book. I don't want to give away spoilers or give away endings, but that is essentially, in a nutshell, the framing that I wanted to then be able to explore within.
Okay. One of your topics is always, or as well, future of work and the influence of AI on that topic. So, which areas of work do you think will change the fastest?
Right. So this is really an interesting area, because for a number of years we've been having this discussion where a number of people are saying an enormous amount of the workspace is going to go away, where half of the people aren't going to have jobs anymore. We can imagine what this would do to the economic engine, to our economies, if this was to actually occur. And the thing is that as powerful, as useful as AI and automation have become, they perform tasks. And I like to try to point out that a task, or even a few tasks, is very different from performing roles, performing jobs as a human employee, where you're engaged in literally hundreds of different types of tasks in an awful lot of our jobs. So if that's the case, can any one or even any dozen AIs really take over from an individual? So yes, we're going to have a range of jobs go away, just like every new technological cycle. But will it be as massive as people were predicting a decade ago? I don't believe so. But I do think that it's happening rapidly enough that, in the interest of protecting our citizens, looking at how we can improve people's lives, that we need to consider that maybe we shouldn't be having our education systems work quite the way they once did, when they were basically modeled on something from a century and a half ago, when it was industrial era education. The tax system, the way that corporations are engaged in upskilling and retraining and so forth, the relationships need to change in order to accept that people will continue during their lifetimes to need to be re-educated or upskilled in terms of new skills as AI comes online, as the next technologies come online. How do they do this without, if you're a 40 or 50-year-old and you're not going to, just give up your job and go back to school, to college for 4 years, 6 years? And by the time you've finished, the technology has changed again.
Yeah.
So we have to have an ongoing process and one that accommodates human realities rather than simply doing it the way we always did.
Mm. And do you think that, is it possible to say which qualities and skills should we develop to thrive in that era?
So people have said, and I agree generally, that maintaining the people skills is very, very important. Whether we're talking about different types of service processes, whether we're talking about healthcare, nursing, these types of things, these are all will continue to be important and difficult to substitute for some time to come. But I also try to be careful about being too niche about it. Through the years, we've had these cycles where people are told, oh, everybody should do this, or everybody needs to learn to code, or so, and again it gets shown to be wrong, or it gets changed and people are left out in the cold. But also we need to recognize that we don't know which skills are going to be needed, truly needed, for some future technology. There are linguists and philosophers who were going to school in the 90s, and they were pretty much told, what are you going to do with this degree? And then along comes AI, and these roles have become so much more important, whether we're talking about ethics, whether we're talking about the importance of understanding linguistics in relation to large language models and different types of voice activation and so forth. All of these things we couldn't have predicted back at that time that these were going to be important fields to be a specialist in.
So it means that we should be flexible and prepared to learn new things. I
think we need to continue to learn new things, be prepared to learn new things. I maintain that as we move into this era that, for many of us, we have been told, or, you'll go to school and if you want to have a certain kind of job, you'll go to school during your early 20s, maybe even your late 20s, and then you'll stop for the most part, and that's it. But if we have a mentality instilled from early on that in life, learning is a continuous process, especially in a world that is continually changing. That is a different kind of mindset, and it's one I think we would be wise to try to encourage going forward.
Okay. We've already mentioned your new book, which was published on September, if I'm right. But what are other projects are you working, and what are your future plans?
So in relation to the book, it's the first in a 4-part series. So I am writing the next book at this time. I continue to do keynotes such as today's for different conferences around the world, work for different organizations depending on need, and sometimes in person, sometimes remote. But it's a kind of a mix, and I really like it that way because I like the variety and I like the continual change and the continual opportunity to learn. Every single client I go into work for, I learn new things, both in terms of getting up to speed for helping them, but also taking in new information from them because ultimately they are the experts in their own field. And so I get to gain from that in both ways. So I really enjoy that.
Okay. Could you tell us what your new book will be about?
Well, the new book continues, as I say, it's a 4-part series. So it continues the existing world and a few of the characters and carries on with some of the themes, but is not it's not cookie cutter. It is something that builds from what has already been established, but there are a lot of surprises that are going to be there that I think readers are going to enjoy.
Okay, so wish you luck. Thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's been a pleasure.